Horror isn't necessarily a genre of exploitation, but it can and often does dip its toe in that murky water. As such, it's no surprise that horror movies' relationship with mental health is at best unsubtle and at worst dangerously unrepresentative. From the earliest days of horror, mental illness was seen as something other to be observed. In Nosferatu, the insane lawyer Knock is presented as much a figure of fear and revulsion as the vampire Count Orlok. It's almost a continuation of the days of public tours of Bedlam, where anyone with the entrance fee was allowed in to gawk at the patients, or, more accurately, at the inmates. There's also always been a deep mistrust of mental health professionals in horror movies. If a psychologist or psychotherapist in a horror movie isn't sinister or a quack, they're often simply wrong, misdiagnosing our poor heroine who is genuinely being stalked by demons as delusional, because what else would they do? This is part of a larger problem that horror movies have with science, where scientific mind is seen as close to possibilities, but often portrayals are even more sinister. In the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, the eponymous doctor hypnotizes a sleepwalker he's meant to be treating and grooms him as a murderer. While the intended subtext of the film is actually about the way soldiers are conditioned to kill by authority figures, it also represents a broader and more literal attitude towards mental health, that undergoing therapy or taking pills will somehow make you not you. The early Gothic tradition in literature, from which the horror genre sprang, featured all sorts of ghosts and apparitions, only to explain them away in the cold light of day as frauds or tricks of the narrator's imagination. This also has ties with the trope of the unreliable narrator in fiction, where the story being told may not be, even within the fictional world of the novel, true. This sort of thing is harder to pull off in film unless a character in the film is literally telling a story, a la The Usual Suspects or The Princess Bride. But by presenting things that exist only in the fractured psyches of our protagonists, movies can get away with literally showing things that we find out later not to be real, or to have been viewed from a skewed perspective. This can be pulled off outside of the horror genre. Fight Club, A Beautiful Mind and Young Adult pull off versions of the same trick, but it's most prevalent in horror movies. Most commonly, one character we believe to be real is not, and is revealed to be part of another character's malady, often at the very end of the film. The classic example is Psycho, where motel owner Norman Bates suffers a mental breakdown after murdering his mother in a fit of Oedipal rage, and then takes on her personality whenever he's in fear of being discovered. Through cleverly placed camera angles, blurred shots and conversations heard but not seen, the viewer's tricked into thinking that Mrs. Bates is still alive. In this case, there was at least someone personifying the imaginary character. This theme crops up in one of the lesser Friday the 13th sequels, where two separate people pretend to be Jason Voorhees after his death. However, it's quite often the case that the imaginary character exists only in the head of the protagonist, and unlike Mrs. Bates or the absent Jason, none of the other characters are even aware that they're meant to exist. In the Amicus anthology Asylum, the screenplay for which was written by psycho-novelist Robert Bloch, a young Charlotte Rampling plays Barbara, who, having just been released from a psychiatric hospital, is plagued by the attentions of her homicidally mischievous friend Lucy, played by Rick Eklund, only to discover that Lucy does not in fact exist, and all her crimes were in fact Barbara's. The tragic ghost story A Tale of Two Sisters, later remade as The Uninvited, inverts audience expectation of this trope. The movie begins with Sue Mi returning from psychiatric hospital, so we're being prepped to learn out for things that are only in the heroine's mind. Reunited with her beloved sister Soo Yeon, the two begins to see the ghost of their mother, who died in mysterious and tragic circumstances the year before. However, in this case, the obviously supernatural element, the ghost, is real, and the apparently innocuous Soo Yeon is imaginary, having also died in the same accident. While it's possible to read Soo Yeon as another ghost, she's only ever acknowledged or seen by Soo Mi, whereas the ghost of their mother is seen by several people, and in the end returns to take her revenge on the maid who had usurped her position in the family. Two films with nearly identical plots, Identity and John Carpenter's The Ward, take this trope to its logical extreme, with both films peopled almost entirely by characters imagined by another character who suffered a breakdown. While Identity at first appears to be a slasher thriller with some odd supernatural elements, and The Ward attempts to paint itself as a ghost story, each character is in fact one of several multiple personalities manifested by a serial killer and an abuse survivor, respectively. Interestingly, both films share a slasher structure, as the personalities are knocked off in a 10 little offensive stereotype style, as the patient is cured of their disorder. Identity is the better of the two films, probably because it's happy to be pulpy and trashy, with the revelation of the killer personality dipping its toe into a separate horror trope, that of the evil murderer's child, seen in everything from The Bad Seed through The Omen and Orphan. The Ward tries and fails at something deeper, as a monstrously disfigured ghost is in fact the true personality of the abused girl, and the tough final girl Kristen represents her most entrenched defense mechanisms. While it's a fairly lowbrow movie that probably doesn't benefit from too deep a reading, the problematic notion that abuse transforms the survivor into something other or even monstrous and ugly is an idea that's still held by many. Even when the notion of the narrative all being in the protagonist's head isn't as on the nose as it is in these examples, it can still be seen in subtext. In The Innocents, adapted from Henry James' classic novella The Turn of the Screw, a naive young governess played by Deborah Kerr takes on the care of two small children, Miles and Flora, who've been largely abandoned by their caddish father. Miss Giddens, played by Kerr, is always sort of flittish and anxious. It's not a massive leap to say that she's suffering from some undiagnosed mental illness. Miss Giddens believes that the house is haunted by the ghost of her predecessor, who committed suicide by drowning herself in the lake, and her brutish lover, Quint. Very much in the archetypal repressed Victorian mould, Miss Giddens is more disturbed by the knowledge of their sexual relationship than she is by the possibility that they've returned from the grave and have possession of the two children that she's in care of. The case for the ghost being purely in Miss Giddens' mind is this: she doesn't see the ghost at all until she hears about Quint's death and her previous governess's suicide, and when she does, they're shadowy figures seen from a distance right out the corner of her eye. She only sees Quint's face clearly, in one of the film's most nightmarish images, once she's seen a photo of him. She never knows what Miss Jessel looks like, and so she never sees her as more than an impression. In this reading, the pressure of responsibility on an already anxious and inexperienced Miss Giddens has snapped her mind. This renders the ending even more tragic. Instead of being killed by Quint, in this version the blame lies solely at the feet of the deluded Miss Giddens. The far less subtle but equally brilliant Candyman treads similar ground. While the film doesn't lean too hard on the notion that the titular bee-themed ghostly serial killer is all in the mind of PhD student Helen, it's certainly easy to read it that way. Helen's arrested and confined to a psychiatric hospital for the Candyman's crimes, but this is all presented in the style of a woman wrongly accused thriller, down to a daring escape through a window and knocking out a nurse to steal her uniform. It's like a particularly blood-soaked episode of The Fugitive. However, Helen only sees the Candyman after she's already suffered a traumatic attack at the hands of a gangster claiming his identity. She suffers from blackouts and what looks like sleep paralysis, and she's always alone with the victim when the Candyman attacks. It's not a massive leap to read the movie as an improbably violent reaction to post-traumatic stress disorder. That is, until a stupid code of multiple graceless sequels spoil this notion, but that's what headcanon's for. While these movies use mental illness to explain away the supernatural, the exact opposite is also a common horror trope. In films such as the classic The Exorcist, mental illness is given a supernatural explanation. In these movies, the outdated belief that people with schizophrenia or other illnesses were possessed by demons is treated as very real indeed. While in The Exorcist, there's nothing wrong with Regan McNeil outside of being possessed by a demon going by the name of Captain Howdy, because nothing's more sinister than someone who sounds like a children's entertainer. A related trope is where existing mental illness leaves the sufferer open to possession, like a weakened spiritual immune system. In Session 9, a sufferer of horror's favourite mental illness, dissociative personality disorder, manifests several distinct personalities that live in different parts of her body. However, one of the personalities is actually a demon who lives in the weak and the wounded, and goaded the patient to murder her family. When a crew of asbestos cleaners arrive at the hospital, the demon moves into one of the crew, who suffered a breakdown following the birth of his child. In The Taking of Deborah Logan, it's Alzheimer's disease that leaves Deborah's mind open to possession by the serial killer she murdered in an act of vigilante justice years before. Quite why this gives her the ability to massively distend her jaw isn't clear, but it looks creepy as hell. Perhaps the most common use of mental illness in horror is as a motive. If someone is mentally ill, that's deemed as explanation enough for all sorts of horrendous crimes. The villains of slasher movies, in particular very early ones such as Black Christmas or Halloween, are often given no more motive for their crimes beyond their insanity. At least not until you get into the Halloween sequels and you have to deal with some old nonsense about cults and curses. In the case of the insane killer, diagnosis is usually kept vague. Hannibal Lecter is described as psychotic in Manhunter and or Red Dragon, but this diagnosis doesn't seem to fit. Dr. Lecter is in fact perfectly lucid with no apparent delusions. It's just that he's also a fan of murdering people and eating their remains alongside ill-advised wine choices. The term they're probably going for is psychopathic, which in layman's terms is a lack of empathy. I'm oversimplifying here because I'm very much a layman. However, even if this was the case, most psychopaths aren't murderers or even violent. A lot of them are investment bankers, which is of course much, much worse. The real diagnosis for Hannibal Lecter is of course a vague sort of Hollywood capital C crazy. It doesn't matter really what's wrong with him, just that he's mad. And isn't that enough? This is a queasy enough attitude to mental health in films, but the real issue here is that this attitude isn't restricted to horror movies, or movies in general. The bogeyman of mental illness crops up time and again in the real world. Take a look at any coverage of a mass shooting on American news. There are sadly plenty to pick from, with incidents reaching almost one a week in 2015. If the shooter's Asian, he's presumed to be an Islamist terrorist. If he's black, gang culture's blamed. And if he, and it is almost always a he, is white, the words you will very quickly hear are mentally ill lone wolf. Even if a killer specifically targets women, people of colour or an abortion clinic, more apparent motives such as misogyny, racism or politics barely get a look in, so quick is the news with the mentally ill descriptor. All of this in spite of the fact that people with mental health issues are actually far less likely to commit violent crimes than those without. Now obviously I'm not blaming the media's prejudices on horror movies. Many of the same news channels I'm implicating here would find horror cinema deeply distasteful. But the way the news and horror use a deliberately vague mental illness motivation for violence in and of itself taps into the same instinct. It's a distancing technique. In the real world, this means that we don't have to question their motive, which would further mean destabilizing the status quo. In horror movies, it makes characters definitively other, more monster than man. They, both the news and horror movies tell you, are not like us. We are not, dear friend, talking about you. Don't worry. It's the same instinct that produces mental patient Halloween costumes. The reality, of course, is that mental health issues are very broad, varied and specific, and affect an equally broad range of people. Your friends, your family, and the narrators of podcasts.